Welcome back, folks, to our discussion on the contrasting approaches of Islam and Christianity regarding women's roles and legal systems, where we dive deep into how each tradition frames justice and equality.
Right. It's fascinating to see how, two major faiths have developed completely different ethical frameworks when it comes to women in law, especially when you look at the historical context.
So, let's start with the claim that Islamic law, as we see it, grants women property rights, inheritance, and even educational opportunities, rights that were groundbreaking even compared to earlier cultures and many Christian societies.
Absolutely. I mean, can you imagine that, it's almost as if Islam introduced these rights at a time when women were otherwise voiceless, and that set a new benchmark for legal protection?
Yes, and there's also the discussion on the hijab, which is presented not as an act of oppression, but rather as a dignified symbol of modesty and self-respect, contrasting sharply with the Western beauty ideals.
Exactly. Although some might argue that the imposition of certain dress codes is restrictive, the perspective here is that it's more about protecting against objectification.
And that's a core point. They see Islamic law as a framework of divine justice with proportional retribution, like an eye for an eye, but tempered with the idea that punishments are meant to discourage wrongdoing rather than just exact vengeance, which is a significant departure from what many imagine.
That idea of proportional justice seems really different from the European Christian legal evolution, where historically the Bible has sometimes been used to justify a limit on women's roles, like in the passages that restrict teaching roles for women.
Exactly. For instance, the texts that restrict women from assuming authoritative roles have long cast a shadow over Christianity's claim of equality, whereas in Islam, scriptures like Quran 4:19 aimed to protect women's autonomy.
But then there's the counterpoint that Christianity is viewed by many as a liberator of women, with teachings emerging from the life of Jesus that celebrated spiritual equality.
True, and documents like Galatians 3:28 reinforce the notion that all, regardless of gender, are equal before God, echoing the idea of inherent spiritual equality.
Yet, it's interesting how these same Christian scriptures sometimes coexist with other passages suggesting certain restrictions on women's roles in society, which makes the debate all the more layered.
Right. It's like Christianity presents a sort of dual legacy. On one side, the radical inclusivity of Jesus' interactions with women, and on the other, texts that have been used to limit women's societal roles, a tension that still sparks conversation today.
And isn't it fascinating how both traditions ground their arguments in sacred texts, yet interpret them so differently, almost like they're reading from the same manual, but coming out with very different instructions?
Absolutely. It's like the narrative in Islamic tradition is that women are, in fact, endowed with rights that were once denied. And these protections are engraved into their legal system as part of a divine blueprint.
While in the Christian context, the defense in our discussion contends that true freedom comes through the liberating message of grace, emphasizing forgiveness and spiritual freedom over legal strictness.
Yes, and that brings us to a critical challenge. Some argue that improper cultural interpretations have led to oppressive practices under Islamic law, citing harsh penalties like those for apostasy or adultery, which the critics say are not compatible with modern human rights.
True, and it's a point often respectfully challenged. While proponents see such measures as deterrents against severe transgressions, others interpret them as being too severe and out of step with contemporary justice, leading to heated debates.
And then there's the debate around the symbolic use of dress, like the hijab, where Islamic teachings promote it as a marker of dignity, yet critics say it may sometimes be enforced coercively.
Right. That opposition reminds us that both traditions are living documents influenced by culture and history, and the real world practices can
Exactly.
diverge from the noble texts.
It's also interesting to consider how legal systems function within these moral frameworks. Islam's system is presented as one that ensures justice and social harmony, while Christianity's emphasis on grace is viewed as promoting a more forgiving society, even if it sometimes leaves legal matters more ambiguous.
And that kind of ambiguity invites constructive critique, because you might ask, if a system leans too heavily on forgiveness without clear guidelines, doesn't that risk inconsistency in social justice? A point that has been raised before.
Definitely. It's like trying to balance on a tightrope between strict legal enforcement and moral liberation. Each approach has its advocates and critics.
Precisely. And then you have the nuanced argument that the legal and ethical contributions of each faith need to be evaluated in light of historical context, not just in absolutes.
Right, because what might seem oppressive from one angle could be seen as protective when you consider the societal norms that prevailed before these reforms were introduced, especially in pre-Islamic Arabia compared to early Christian societies.
And then there's the issue of modern reinterpretation, how contemporary scholars and communities reinterpret and sometimes challenge both traditions to align with present-day human rights ideals.
Exactly. The dynamic evolution of interpretation is key. It's almost like both legal ethical frameworks are constantly in dialogue with their historical contexts and modern values,
indeed.
Which keeps the conversation very much alive and evolving.
That continuous reinterpretation also means new debates keep arising, like comparing the proclaimed intentions of justice versus the actual impact on women's societal roles, leading to the kind of rigorous courtroom debate we've been exploring here.
And speaking of the courtroom debate, it's striking how the arguments, both for and against, are firmly grounded in key sacred texts, which underscores how, these are not just legal issues, but deeply theological and ethical ones that influence millions of lives.
Yes, it's a complex interplay of theology, law, and social ethics, where no side has a monolithic view, inviting respectful critique and ongoing dialogue.
And I appreciate that even as we navigate these debates, there's a clear need for both traditions to critically assess their historical practices in light of modern values, while still honoring the profound spiritual heritage they both offer.
Absolutely. And I think that nuanced critique is essential, because while the prosecution champions the idea of a divinely inspired legal framework in Islam, the defense correctly points out that Christianity's ethos of grace has also played a liberating role.
True, and it's this respectful tension between law and moral freedom that can ultimately guide societies to continually reflect on justice, ensuring that the rights and dignity of women are always at the forefront.
And as our discussion winds down, it's clear that both perspectives present compelling arguments, even if they sometimes contest each other on the specifics of enforcement and cultural adaptation, which just makes for a richer conversation overall.
No doubt, these debates filled with historical nuance and theological rigor remind us that no legal or ethical system is perfect, but each provides valuable insights into the pursuit of justice and respect for human dignity.
And that ultimately encourages communities to keep questioning, refining, and, engaging with their traditions in ways that promote progress, which is the real essence of a dynamic faith.
Well, as we prepare to move on to our next session, focusing on even more challenging themes like violence in Scripture and whether peace is truly promoted in these texts, I think we can all agree that these conversations are crucial for understanding our modern world.
Absolutely. Thanks for this enlightening back and forth, and let's keep exploring these deep issues with the care and respect they deserve. Until next time.
Indeed.